Hello, everyone, and welcome to Make It Mindful, the podcast where we explore how to keep schools relevant by looking through the lens of mindfulness and asking the question, what's really worth paying attention to here? I'm your host, Seth Fleischauer. In each episode, I interview educational change makers striving to understand what they do, why it works, and how it can lead to practical, transformative solutions for teaching. This week, my guest is Judy Paulick from the University of Virginia. Welcome, Judy. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Seth.
Judy, could you start by introducing yourself to our listeners?
Absolutely. So I am currently an associate professor of elementary education at the University of Virginia, and I train elementary teachers for language arts instruction and family engagement. Here I also coordinate our elementary teacher ed programs. And I my focus is very much on that intersection of language arts and literacy and equity and family engagement. So the ways that we can that language arts teachers or teach elementary teachers in general can learn about families and then bring what they learn back to their language arts instruction and to their classrooms in general.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I love this. And our listeners should know that this episode is part of the 2024 National Literacy Month with RIF campaign, a partnership between the B Podcast Network and Reading is Fundamental. And so this literacy piece is obviously what relates it to reading is fundamental. The culture, the community engagement piece, I think that's what the B Podcast Network thought when they set you up with me, right? Because this is work that I do interculturally. I work with students in Taiwan. I also teach students here stateside about cultural competence. And I was so fascinated to learn about this focus of yours, specifically around like home visits and ways to leverage the assets that exist within a community and how you can translate that into real teaching. And so I want to unpack a lot of the parts of this and why it works, what it is, and why it works. So first of all, you talk about like an asset-based approach to home visits. I am a huge fan of home visits. I learned about them when my stepmom, who's a teacher in the 90s, she did them through her school. And it just like blew my mind how like positive this was for everybody involved, right? Like you've got the parents who feel like they really know who the teacher is because they've broken bread with them, or metaphorically at least, or maybe sometimes literally. You've got the student isn't going to feel as nervous going to the classroom because they know the teacher. The teacher has literally seen where this person lives as a way to like understand them on a personal level that goes way beyond what you're going to be able to just get from being in the classroom, especially in those first few weeks. And so it just starts off the year on this like incredibly like personal and like such an authentic connection that you've made. But your work is about how to do this right. And what I just
Mm-hmm.
described is something that like feels like it could be, universally good no matter how you approach it. But you talk about an asset-based approach. What does that mean? What are the teachers looking for when they're doing these home visits?
It's a great question. And I'm also glad that you already have this background and understanding and had this personal experience with home visiting as a positive experience. Um, Home visiting has this association with social work and public health workers, where it can be, and with all best intention and with lots of great outcomes, it can be professionals going into homes and seeing what's wrong and
Mm-hmm.
uh, and helping to try to fix what's wrong. And you know, uh, clear, yes, there are things that those professionals are able to identify and support. And even with teachers, sometimes we have Head Start teachers and early childhood teachers go in and help families get acclimated to schools. And that is can be really helpful. But again, it's about kind of imposing the structures of schools and schooling on families rather than going in and learning about who families are, what they do, what their experiences are, and what their assets are. And so when we're thinking about assets in terms of going into homes, we're thinking about, I frame it around Louise Moll's work of Funds of Knowledge and Tara Yoso's work of community cultural wealth. And so it's kind of all of the things that families are providing to their children in terms of language and skills, the stories that families tell, the values, and what Goldenberg calls cultural models that families have from their in their life. It's all of this stuff that if we're going in with into homes thinking, okay, well, families are not doing this and not doing that, then we're not going to see those assets. So, for example, like I'm a language and literacy person, and so a lot of what I'm thinking about are the family literacy practices that families are already engaging in. So things like when families are texting or writing letters to relatives and other contacts, people that their loved ones elsewhere. When families are doing things like storytelling and engaging in storytelling that may be similar to or different from kind of mainstream dominant ways of storytelling, when they're reading religious texts in the home, when they're playing video games with each other. All of those things are literacy practices that families are engaging in and that teachers can learn about and learn from. But it's deeper, it's even deeper than that. It's also about, again, this idea of cultural models, or Zaretta Hammond talks about kind of the ways that um, families engage in culture. And so that may be things like, things that teachers would be able to see on an everyday basis: how children dress, what they, the music they listen to, the books they read, those kinds of things. But it's also the deeper ways that families engage with each other. So it's thinking about, one example I really like is, kind of mainstream white American culture is very competitive, right? Like competitiveness, being competitive is a value that is,
It's a virtue,
um,
right? Yeah.
it is a virtue, right?
Yeah.
And so it's, and it shows up in classrooms a lot too, right? Like I know when I was teaching third graders, we would often review math concepts using like Jeopardy, and they would play against each other. And, but there are like so many cultures where cooperation is the more, um, is the virtue, right? Is the cultural model. And so if you can go into a home and listen to family stories and look for the evidence of those cultural models, then those are things that you're able to bring back into the classroom. So it really is, or just even like how 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 family members engage with each other when they're having conversation. Do adults and do children look adults in the eye? Is that a thing that happens? Is the um how stories are told, and how, like, there's so much richness that you can see when you're engaging with families, that's really that you wouldn't necessarily know by talking to a child or even reading their writing, or other ways that we typically have to to learn about children and their lives and what they value.
Wow. Okay. I have so many questions. Because I really want to understand how this works. And I really want to understand also, if you're not at a school that does these types of home visits, how can you leverage these assets? And there's a couple of different like lines of questioning, and I'm hoping that we'll get to all of them. But the first one I want to do is that question, right? So like, if I am a teacher who wants to leverage these community assets, I do not have access to my students' homes. What can I do to learn about those assets to be able to leverage them in the classroom?
Or I'm going to back up just for 1 second, if that's okay, just to describe, because the only way that teachers and communities and schools get the visits going is
Mm.
by advocating for them in the first place. And I just want
Thank
to
you. Thank you. Yeah,
shout,
yeah.
I
Don't want
just
to
want
skip
to
over that part. Yeah, thank you.
Right. So I want to shout out the organization. It's called Parent Teacher Home Visits. They're based in Sacramento, California. They've been training folks and supporting schools, and generally schools are using Title I funding to fund, because you really need to make sure that teachers are being compensated for the visits. They started their work more than 25 years ago, and um, kind of evolving their organization as well, which has been great to see, and evolving their training. But they help to get the structures in place in school districts, and then they partner with school districts to make sure that it's an option. So I just want to make sure that we're not like off the bat ruling out the possibility that a particular context could implement home visits. And then these home visits that they do are generally like they do them, or they suggest doing them once at the beginning of the year and once in January, to kind of build the relationship and then continue, or to initiate the relationship and then build it. And the visits are very much about relationship building. And so I just wanted to, and yeah, I just wanted to kind of put
And
that out there first.
yeah, and
Um,
I do want to thank you too. Like part of what this podcast is about is mindset. And what you, I think, just called out with me was like a fixed mindset toward the like teacher perspective of like, I'm overwhelmed. How do I understand that you're telling me something that is like idealistically great, but like, how do I actually work it into
yeah,
like my schedule? Like I was kind of coming with that fixed mindset. So
yeah,
I appreciate you calling me out on that and backing up and saying like, hey, even if you don't have that, even if you don't have this, it is possible to get it. And here's an avenue. So thank you for doing that. Now let's
yes,
assume that
yes,
in the meantime, while we were looking towards these roads of like bringing it into our class, the funds and being able to make it happen from like a a systemic level. What else can we do as teachers?
yeah. So, well, I think that all of any relationship building that teachers do with families pays off in space. So that starts before school begins, with once teachers get their class lists and making some sort of contact with families and finding out what the preferred contact avenue is for the family, whether it's text or email or phone calls. And then doing that on a consistent basis, right? Like, so building and doing it, especially if there are children, and as teachers, there are often children from day one where you know that there might be some challenges. And so, but starting off that communication positively so that you can build a relationship, because often there's a tension. I work with a lot of young teachers, and they're worried about engaging with families because they're like, I don't have children. What do I know?
Mm,
Um, and a lot of, there are lots of families who've had, either just unpleasant or neutral or traumatic experiences with schools and schooling, and they don't want to engage with teachers. And so the more that teachers can humanize themselves and reach out and build the relationship and build
mm,
trust with families, I think that's so much of the goal. And then it creates opportunities. So even if this isn't a home visit and isn't going into a home for, these visits are generally about maybe 25 minutes, and it's really just about having a conversation with the family. It's really just about building the relationship and centering the family, because so much of what happens in interactions between families and schools is just centering the school. Um, it's you come learn about
mm.
what we're doing. Let me tell you about your
Yeah,
child,
yeah, yeah.
right? We know that families are children's first teachers, most consistent teachers, best teachers, and so
Mm,
creating avenues for the relationship building and the trust building allows not only for families to feel valued by the teacher, but it also then creates space for the teacher to learn about the family. So if you can do that through other means. I mean, it also happens through the ways, back to school night is happens everywhere. So how do you do that? Do you do that by talking at the families for 20 minutes, or do you do that by inviting families in to come to share about themselves, having them, you know, fill out a form or make a video or
Mhm.
bring the child in to share a story, inviting families into the classroom to share something about themselves with the class. Like, I think there are just so many ways of making sure that when there's a publishing party, so we always, at the end of a writing unit would have a little publishing party and invite families to that so that they have opportunities to be in the space, build the trust, see what kids are doing, and share their expertise. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't have to be about being in the home, and maybe they should just be called family visits. But I like the home piece of it allows the teacher to like literally step inside the family space,
Mhm.
like to literally center the family and to be surrounded by the family's artifacts so that there are points of conversation, like there's ways um to to concretely learn about who the family is. But you can do that also through a quick Zoom call with a family. We, during COVID, we had our student teachers doing home visits via Zoom and said to the family, hey, bring one thing that's important to you over to the Zoom. And then it's the same thing. It's a discussion, it's a conversation, it's the family sharing their stories. So I
Yeah.
think the home visit and having the opportunity to like be in the family space is great, but it's definitely not necessary. And I've also, I have teachers who will go to a soccer game because the parents are going to like, or a caregiver of some sort is going to be at the soccer game anyway. So then it allows, you can have a little side conversation, cheer on the kid. It humbles you, it humbles the teacher to the family, and it allows for the relationship building. So I think there
Mhm.
are lots of ways to like get at the same ideas of centering the family and learning about the family.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is that home visits are an avenue, and there are myriad avenues, and
Yeah.
it's about how you leverage those avenues. And really
Yep.
what I'm hearing is that it's about mindset, right? Like just like the asset based home visit is about the mindset of discovering those assets and rather than the deficiencies, it's also a mindset of curiosity and wanting to learn more about the family by centering the family.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, because mindset is a practice, right? So you can say these things to young teachers, but
Mhm.
how do you help them truly adopt the mindset?
I can't claim to have been successful in doing this with and for all of my student teachers. But I think it starts both by understanding kind of the broader social context and kind of inequalities and power differentials and oppression more broadly, because we tend to we know what we know what we've experienced. We also know that 80% of teachers entering the workforce are white, monolingual, English speaking, cishet women. And so and that's one kind of valid great experience, and there are myriad other kinds of valid great experiences that their students and their students families will have had. So understanding both that there are lots of ways of knowing and being that are normal and good, and valid, and also understanding their own positionality in terms of like, okay, well, what is my culture? Who am I? What are my cultural models? How do I enact them? So again, like this idea of like competition versus cooperation. Well, which one did your family value? And that's great. It's important to like to um, to have embraced and to feel like your upbringing was nurturing, but you also need to be able to acknowledge and understand that other ways of knowing and being are equally nurturing, good, and valuable. And so we start with a lot of identity work and positionality
Mm.
work, understanding who you are, what you do to enact that, and that there are lots of ways of doing the same thing. There are different ways of demonstrating love. There are different ways of demonstrating intelligence. There are different ways of being in the world. And so it has to start with that. And it has to also start with acknowledging that everybody has biases. Like it's the human condition um, to believe that some ways of of knowing and being are normal and good, and others are not so normal, or and to sort of otherize. And so if we can get to a point where we're able to acknowledge that, then we can push through it. And so we do things like identity wheels and taking the implicit associations test to understand. That's like the through researchers at Harvard that who uh, to be able to see, well, what are the groups that we may have biases against, and and then we know that, and the research is really clear that the ways um, to move past, to deconstruct bias, is to engage in productive struggle with people who embody the the identity that against which we have a bias. And so what better way to do that than to like work with the family to support a child? Like if you're the teacher, especially in elementary classrooms where you have, your 20 or 24 kids that you're working with across the year, you have the opportunity to really engage with families to support that child. And
Can
so
Sorry, can you break that down a little bit more? The word you used was struggle, right? So you said that like
productive.
productive struggle. Are you saying that ideally this is a struggle? Cause like for me, ideally it's like,
That's a
you
great
come
yeah.
in, right? You come in and it's good, right? Like, and there's like a give and take, but like, I mean, is that the struggle you're talking about? Like, how much of a struggle do we want this to be?
Well, I mean, I think productive struggle can also be like, I with my student teachers, I have them like do these group worthy tasks where they have to like solve a puzzle together. And that can be struggle. And when you're working with people who are different from you, you're coming at it from slightly different perspectives. And I think that's what I mean by struggle, is that you may be coming from like, as a parent, I don't think, first graders should have homework. I think my child should get to come home and have dinner with the family and do what we want to do together. But as the teacher, like maybe I think that it's important for them to be doing particular things at night. So finding like working together to figure out what's going to work best for the child. I guess that's how I would describe the struggle. But sometimes it's more struggly than other times. Depending on kind of where the family and the teacher are coming from. But doing that together in service of the child is is what is kind of the goal.
I imagine that one of these struggles, and this is something that I struggled with as a young teacher who didn't have kids, um, but I had certain values, right? And I was raised with certain values, and there are many cultures that haven't necessarily like changed into like modern times, as like they haven't embraced some of the modern thinking around like gender roles and things like that, and some of the more conservative family structures can feel like a values thing, right? Where it's like, if I'm looking at this family, it might seem like they're not giving, for example, their girl the same opportunity that they are giving their boy, right? Do you consider that like, is that an asset that you are that you can then leverage into the classroom? Like, how do you coach teachers to navigate that discomfort?
Oh my gosh, that's hard. It's a lot, right? So I think that it's, as long as the family isn't doing something that is, explicitly and actively harming the child, then I do coach my students to be able to see, okay, so what are the opportunities that the family is providing, like for example providing for girls, then like what is it that the child is learning in that context, and then what are some like what are ways to understand how and why the family is doing what they're doing. And I think that's the biggest piece of it, is the understanding how and why. So if the how and why um is because it's part of thousands of years of a religious practice, for example, right? So it has to do with like young girls covering themselves. I don't know if that was part of your experience. But then, so how do we then like make sure that the family feels valued in what they do and who they are? Make sure the child feels honored and valued within the classroom so that the child can learn what they need to learn to be successful in the classroom. And then, I mean, I also, for better or worse, in my teacher ed classrooms, make sure that we're also providing, windows for children to see what's possible in the contexts where they live. And so it's not about like, you know, positioning yourself against the family, because that's not going to work anyway. The child is part of the family. The family is who the child belongs to, and is, and we want that family, like the love of the family
Yeah, that
is the
belonging.
most
Yeah.
important thing for the child. And so I do think that we can make progress toward creating the relationships that help to bring us closer together in what we're wanting. Every family wants what's best for their child. It's just that sometimes the definition of best is different than what is kind of mainstream white American
Yeah.
best for. And it's not teachers' place to say what's best for children, but it's teachers' responsibility to provide opportunities for children to see what the possibilities are, and for families to see that too. But we don't get to undermine what families are doing unless it's actively harmful for children.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something I think about a lot because we operate interculturally at Banyan Global Learning. We teach students who are in Asia, in East Asia, and we are very, very conscious of cultural imperialism, right? Like we don't want to
Mm-hmm.
come off that like our way is the way, and therefore you should act that way. At the same time, part of the value that we bring is that we are teaching about another culture. We are offering a different way of thinking, and
Yep.
so there are some lines, right? And it's because it's like, okay, you want to center the student in their experiences, but you also want to prepare them to engage cross culturally, and so they might need to understand how their customs, values, lifestyle fits into that larger cultural context, and how they
Yep.
might be perceived if they talk about things in a certain way. um, and so I think we've started to like kind of get to like where the rubber meets the road here, which is how do we leverage these, especially literacy, because this is for the literacy month, these literacy assets when it comes to actual classroom activities and instruction, right? Like you mentioned, a household that has literacy practices of texting their loved ones elsewhere, of storytelling, maybe of religious texts and video games. These are all assets. How do you take that knowledge into the classroom and create an approach that's going to work for not just those students, but for all the students in the classroom who might have a different set of assets in their home, right? So how do
Yep.
you do this?
Um, so I think we're only just starting to figure this out, right? So like I just want to say that like, this notion of culturally responsive, relevant, sustaining teaching, which is what we would be informing through these home visits, has been theorized for now it's 30 years and probably longer than that. And but the like sort of rubber hitting the roadness has, because it's so contextual, has lagged. And the empirical research on it has lagged even more. So
Sounds like a
what I'm
standard
saying are,
educational issue. We're
right. Yeah,
30 years
exactly.
behind the research. I got it.
Yes.
Okay.
So I have some suggestions, but I am sure that there are many, many more ways that one could do this effectively, and we need to continue studying that. I think the first thing, and this is low-hanging fruit, is the literature that the children's literature that is available in classrooms and that teachers choose. I mean, doesn't it can also be from the library that teachers bring into their classrooms, and making sure that that literature is, and I love the idea of like windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, like that children
Mm,
can see themselves in the literature that's in the classroom. All children, every child can see themselves in some of the literature, that they are able to see the world and the variety of ways of knowing and being in the world, and that they're able to sometimes like step outside themselves into, like be able to see themselves
mm.
moving from one to the other.
Ooh, I'd
So,
heard the first
but
two before, but I hadn't heard the sliding doors. I love that.
so I think making sure that the literature and being so purposeful about, across different social identities, and across different kinds of experiences and across different like geographies, there's no like absolutely like anytime you're doing a read aloud, or having children read a text, making sure that it is purposefully helping to enrich those like understandings. I think the other, like in sticking with literacy again, having children creating books. So I've seen like in classrooms, you know, all families, all cultures have some sort of like bread product, right? And so finding ways to like creating a class book that's the stories of bread across all of the different homes and cultures, or you could do that with other things too. But I think bread is this thing that like really does like kind of like
Yeah,
bring us
it's the
together.
metaphor for close connection with people you don't know,
Right.
breaking bread, right? Yeah.
Right. And but creating though also like just books that are the story, like family stories. So then, so families are able to like bring their whatever a family story that's meaningful to them is into the classroom, and then they're available to read and do it in English and in whatever the home language is of the family, if that's a possibility, right? Like without right severely like inconveniencing families. But we have so much technology that we can use for that. So books and books, inviting families into the classroom, I think is a really important way of doing that. But then also like figuring out, well, what are the cultural models that families in the classroom are like, what are their values, right? And so if they're, when we think about nature or religion, or like kind of how people engage with each other, figuring out what those things are and then finding ways to bring that into the classroom. So for example, um, if if I go visit and I see that a lot of my families are, and even if they're not, so that we're exposing children to other ways of knowing and being, are there's older kids taking care of younger kids as part of the kind of value or cultural model in the neighborhood or in the family. Um, there's Why not do that across grade levels in an elementary school? Partner with, if I'm a first grade teacher, partner with a fifth grade teacher and find ways to incorporate that as part of what we do in our classroom. That sort of caring for each other. If I think another piece of it, and if we're thinking about like kind of this idea of culturally relevant teaching and how we then enact it in classrooms using these assets, then we also need to think about like how um, how the school is reaching back out to the community. So if there are things going on in the community that the teachers learn about through children, families, home visits, that they can engage with. Like I, at, at one of the schools that I was working at, um, or working with, there was like a one particular intersection um, that was problematic in like near the school where kids were trying to walk home, and teachers learned about it, and the teachers brought it up with the administration, and the administration talked um, to the officials in the town, and they were able to get a blinking light there instead of and so like those kinds of things where it's reaching out in both directions can be really powerful in building those, continuing to build the relationship, and building trust, and making sure that it's not, kind of teachers imposing this thing on families, but we're really integrating families' values into classrooms and schools as well.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from you is that there's not necessarily like a roadmap. It's not like take an asset and like apply this formula to it and then you get an
No,
output, right? Like this is
no.
about this, right? This is about like understanding, being curious enough and focusing on relationship building enough so that you understand the context of the asset that you're dealing with enough to be able to consider how you might bring it into the classroom in a way that's meaningful and authentic. And that the way that you do that is going to depend on that context, but also on your own personal creativity as a teacher and what you happen to be teaching at that time. And I think that, a lot of teachers, obviously we bring this job home with us, right? Like I was
Yes.
just in Asia the other day, and like woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning and like designed a virtual learning experience in my head for like an hour, because it was like something that I was engaged with and passionate about, and my fire was burning, and rather it not be at 2 o'clock in the morning. But you find yourself as you go through your day, like thinking about your day, what you've done, your students, what you're doing with them, and the more context you have via that relationship building, the more likely it is that you will make those creative connections, whether they be a shower thought that you have or something that you're explicitly doing in a grade level meeting. I would also like to toss out the possibility of people using AI for something like this, because AI
Yeah.
is a really awesome, really, really, really powerful for differentiation. And so if you have that cultural context, and with everything AI, the more information you give it, the better result you're going to get. So if you can
Yep.
provide that context of like, here's what I know about my relationship with these people, here's what I know about this asset, here's what I know about why it's important to this community, here's what I'm trying to do over here academically, here are my limitations in terms of like time and who I am and my identity, my background. Can you put this all together
Mm-hmm.
into a thing that
Mm-hmm.
like, give me 10 ideas about like how I can work this into my math curriculum?
Yep.
I think it's have you had people use AI for that sort of
I
thing? I see your
haven't
head
yet, but
nodding.
now I will.
Awesome. Yeah. And, like everything AI, you have to have the human judgment on the other end of it to understand if it's a
Right.
good idea or not. But it's a
And
really
that
great idea generator.
and that also gets back to the judgment about, so yes, it's so much about knowing your students and who they are, but it has to start with knowing yourself and who you are and what you're
Yes.
bringing, and not just normalizing your ways of knowing and being and then seeing everything else as other.
Hmm.
And knowing what kinds of assets to be looking for, because otherwise it's if you're limiting it to the things that you value, you're going to miss all of the other possibilities of things that are out there.
Yeah.
So like, for example, if we only see reading and writing as like, do you read to your kids at night, and like, do you write stories with them, but you're not looking at all of those other literacy practices that we were talking about, then it really limits the like, then you're not able to see all of what you need to see. And if you don't know that about yourself, you don't know to look for the things. And
Yeah.
so there's all that stuff that it's almost like AI. Like you gotta know yourself well enough to know what to
Uh-huh.
look for to make the search terms.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's honestly, it's one of the things that I love about this opportunity of having AI is that like, in order to get a good response, like you have to know what you're looking for. And in this case, it's incredible, as you say, it's incredibly important for you to not only know what you're looking for, but also to understand the cultural context around all of it, right? And
Yep.
I think back to uh, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Do you know that
Mm-hmm.
the TED talk that she
Yeah.
did on a single story, right?
Yep.
The idea being that like as humans, with all of our implicit biases, like we seek to tell, like we fall into the trap of telling a single story about people,
Yeah.
and then that story encapsulates everything that you know and understand about them, and it's
I
and
can I just can I
please,
interrupt you for a second? Because that's
yeah,
literally what we start with in our teacher ed program. Like that is
ah,
at orientation day one, we start with that TED talk and then pulling it apart and thinking about, okay, so what is a single story? Why is it problematic? How does this
yeah,
work? And who are we?
yeah, and you are in the business of of enabling teachers to break past the single story, to get the entire
Yes.
context, to get as many stories as they can.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
And it
beautiful.
also, the other thing that it does is like, in this context of, and I think we like keep coming back to like teachers having lots of freedom and then they get constrained and then they have more
Hmm.
freedom and then they get constrained. And I think we're in a constrained context right now in terms of what teachers are allowed to, or, to do, or that there's so much they're supposed to be doing that there isn't the space for additional things. But I think this kind of knowledge and this kind of experience helps to it helps with teachers feeling agentic in their classrooms, and having that kind of agency, I think, allows then teachers to want to, I think it helps teachers to want to stay in the classroom, to feel like
Hmm.
that they know this stuff about their families. They are able to be to approach their work in ways that like nobody else would be able to do exactly what they're doing, because they have all of this information and background. And it can be, I don't know, it's I've seen it be empowering for teachers also, and that's part of what we want to empower families, but we also want to empower teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Judy, so much for being here. I think my mic just transferred to a different mic, and so apologies for the change in audio. But but thank you so much, Judy, for being here and for sharing your work, for diving into these deep questions with me. For our listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, we'd love to have you as a subscriber. You'll get more conversations about literacy as well as practical transformative solutions for teaching. You can also learn more about the B Podcast Network shows at uh, bpodcast.network. That is bepodcast.network. And learn more about Reading is Fundamental at www.rif.org.
And I want to also shout out our Reading is Fundamental has is just in the process of launching an early childhood um, education center that has amazing materials, really, really well curated and well done for teachers and for families to support children's reading. And the materials um, are very purposefully, culturally responsive, and culturally competent. So folks can check those out, teachers and families.
Awesome. We will definitely have that link in the show notes. Thank you so much again, Judy. Thank you, as always, to our editor, Lucas Salazar. And remember that if you want to bring positive change to education, you must first make it mindful. See you next time.